Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today in Sacramento, but I thank you for allowing me to join you, as the ancient Greeks might have said, telemimetically. This is truly a special occasion for a couple of reasons. Today, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the University of California Center Sacramento, a one-of-a-kind system-wide resource of which all of us in the UC community are very proud. We also gather to hear former Berkeley Chancellor and current Professor Robert Birgeneau speak on a critical and very timely topic: public higher education, income inequality, and the future of America. To UCCS, I want to deliver my personal congratulations and admiration for your 10-year milestone. For a decade, you've been known for excellence and impact in education, research, and public service. What makes this excellence possible and your program so exciting is their close engagement with the actual development of public policy at the state level. You benefit California by giving students the hands-on education that will enable them to make a positive difference in policymaking, journalism, or related fields. You benefit California also by pursuing critical research and sharing it with policymakers in all branches and at all levels of state government. By performing these functions, UCCS plays a uniquely valuable role in helping UC fulfill its land-grant mission of bettering the lives of all of the people in our state. This year, UCCS is running a thematic mini-series on the topic of equality, inequality, and prosperity. The Center deserves our thanks for advancing our understanding of these issues, both in the mini-series and in today's lecture. It's no exaggeration to say that a growing crisis of economic inequality is transforming our state and country in diverse and alarming ways. As everyone here knows, the University of California, like all institutions of public higher education, finds itself right in the middle of this crisis. Financial difficulties prevent or discourage many deserving California students from enrolling or staying enrolled at a UC campus. There's also the question of how the changing distribution of wealth is affecting UC's priorities in education, research, and perhaps its institutional character and mission. On a happier note, we know that a UC education can also be an important part of the solution to inequality. All of us at UC are especially proud that through our educational programs, we can often play a pivotal role in giving our students an opportunity for a brighter future. We are also proud that we can help address inequality by giving state policymakers the benefit of our research, in large part through UCCS. It's now my honor and great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Robert Birgeneau. He's one of those individuals who needs no introduction, but it's worth reminding ourselves how fortunate we are to have him speak with us. In one of his lives, I'll refer only to two of them today, he is an internationally distinguished physicist. Speaking as a humanist, I'm always a bit in awe of this credential, especially considering that this is not the only noteworthy thing he does. Professor Birgeneau is more famously an international leader in higher education. To his great credit, he is well known for his strong commitment to diversity and equity in the academic community. In 2004, he became the 9th Chancellor of UC Berkeley, serving for 9 years in that position before stepping down in 2013. Among the signal accomplishments of his chancellorship was the successful advancement of a vision that stressed the importance of upholding access and excellence. Before coming to Berkeley, Professor Birgeneau served 4 years as president of the University of Toronto. Before that, he was dean of the School of Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he spent 25 years on the faculty. Impressively, he's a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of London, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among other scholarly societies. Over the course of his career, he has received many awards for teaching and for his research on the fundamental properties of materials. Today, he is the Silverman Professor of Physics, Materials Science, and Engineering at UC Berkeley. In addition, he leads the Lincoln Project, an initiative of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that bears the name of the U.S. President under whose administration legislation creating land-grant universities was passed and signed into law. The Lincoln Project has two extremely important goals: to advocate for the importance of public colleges and universities, and to devise strategies to reverse the progressive disinvestment in public higher education by government. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to add that Professor Birgeneau was my chancellor for my final year as Executive Dean of Berkeley's College of Letters and Science and Dean of Arts and Humanities. In the one short year of our overlap, I came to appreciate how profound his commitment to equity and diversity is. It touched me personally. Berkeley, the entire UC system, and all of higher education have benefited from his example and from his lesson that universities honor excellence best when they honor these principles. For all of these reasons, I'm delighted to share the podium, at least in a virtual sense, with him today. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Birgeneau. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today in Sacramento.
Well, I'm always afraid to talk after an introduction like that, right? You know, the reality is always a shadow of the introduction. Anyway, as advertised, I'm going to talk about the Lincoln Project, but when Rich invited me last May to give this talk, I couldn't have imagined, and we ended up on this date. I didn't think about the timing, so I couldn't have imagined that we would have the very interesting political situation we have right now with the University of California budget. And so I'm going to have some very strong statements about that, about the implications for diversity specifically, which has been left out of the public discussion in its entirety. And so I'm going to talk about that later on in my talk, and I'm going to forecast it, show you how diversity will be seriously impacted negatively if the tuition increases are not approved or were not approved. So this is going to be counterintuitive, so I'm going to have to explain how our financial aid system works and why Napolitano budget supports diversity as opposed to the opposite, which the media have so far been implying. So I'm forecasting for you. So I guarantee I hope some controversy and some active discussion. But I first want to start with the Lincoln Project. So as you heard, this is a project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. For those of you who are not academics like myself, you may not have heard of the American Academy. Let me just move stuff away. But of the honorific societies, one of the ones I like the best is the American Academy because it's the broadest base. So it has physicists like myself, but it has Daniel Day-Lewis, the actor. It has former governors, Governor of Tennessee, Phil Bredesen, who's an important part of our project, actually, K. Bailey Hutchison, former senator from Texas, and it has great philanthropists, like the Haas family, Bob Haas, for example. So it's a very broadly based and therefore represents a particularly valuable venue for a project looking at public education, which has societal impact, which stretches all of the way. I'll tell you one anecdote about the American Academy, and I know this is being filmed, so as long as he doesn't see it, it doesn't matter. So one of the sort of public figures, entertainment figures who was inducted recently was a singer. I'm sitting in the front row of the induction ceremony at the American Academy in Cambridge. And I elbowed my wife and I said, "Hey, there's Paul Simon's father." Then we come. This really dates me. Then when he sort of is accepting his induction, he stands up and sings a song, and I realize it's not Paul Simon's father, it's Paul Simon, actually. But anyway, but it's nice to be in a society that has Paul Simon himself, not his father, and academics like myself. So one of the things, and I'm going to show you lots of data, because I'm a physicist, so therefore I like quantitative things. I'm impatient with sort of generalizations that are not fact-based, which we see too much of in education. And so one of the things we're doing in this project is collecting quantitative data and trying to make sure we understand how things actually work and what the implications are of policy or political decisions on quantitative things like financial aid and costs, et cetera, and quality of institution. One of the things you discover immediately is that in spite of our unhappiness in California with the disinvestment by the state government, and we have every right to be unhappy, we're far from unique. And actually, there are many states where it's actually worse than it has been in California. So one of the things we've been trying to do is to collect meaningful data at a national level. And I'm going to show you who's on the committee, et cetera. But in addition to collecting data, we're also doing site visits. And so last month we were in Virginia and met with the presidents of all the universities in Virginia. And that was eye-opening. Our next site visit, next two are to New York to do the metropolitan New York area, City College and all of that. And then we're going to Texas. I'm sorry, we're doing Texas first and then New York. Then we're going to Texas where, because of the Tea Party and their influence in Texas politics, higher education has been really threatened in a way that we couldn't imagine in California. So we're going to learn about that. So this is a national issue. With the Lincoln Project, we're mostly focusing on financial rather than governance issues, frankly. As we're doing these site visits, I'm learning more and more that governance is as important as finances. And there are different governance systems in every state. So what we will and will not be able to say about that, I'm not sure. I'm not going to talk about governance here. I'm going to just show you some quantitative things. So so what we're basically hoping for is a second Morel Act, a Morel Act of the 21st century. So President Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, aided by, I guess it was, I think Congressman Morel, but I'm not sure, did this brilliant thing of creating the land-grant universities across the entire country. And we need something similar from the federal government at the national level, in our opinion. And I'm going to talk about other actors as well. Okay. So this is the committee. Actually, the committee's evolving as we find that there are skill sets that we need as our understanding evolves. But you can see I'm not going to read off all the names, but we have university leaders from California, myself, and Gene Block, the director of UCLA. The project's co-chaired by myself and Mary Sue Coleman, who was first president at the University of Iowa and for the last 12 years president at the University of Michigan, one of the most esteemed leaders of public higher education in the United States, a wonderful, highly skilled person. We have Phil Bredesen, the former governor of Tennessee, who served as governor for 8 years in Tennessee, a moderate Republican, I believe, although I know he's moderate. I'm not certain which party he belonged to. But very, very knowledgeable and provides academics like me reality checks all the time about what is and is not politically feasible in various states. And Kay Bailey Hutchison, esteemed senator from Texas. We have a number of business people. Carl Gardino, who's head of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, president of it. Bob Haas. One of the more interesting business people is Patrick Doyle from Michigan. So he's the president of Domino's Pizza, and an incredibly articulate advocate for public education. And I particularly like him because when he became president of Domino's Pizza, he got on national television and he said, "I know why you don't buy Domino's Pizza." He said, "The reason is it doesn't taste very good." Like, I know why you don't support public education, because we do a lousy job. So that would be the functional equivalent, right? Which I'm not going to say, obviously, because we do a very good job, actually. Anyway, but in any case, and he said, "I'm going to make it different." And so he turned around Domino's Pizza completely. This is the kind of communication skill and advocacy that we need in public higher education. So he's been a great addition. One of the other people is Jim Hackett, and if you read the newspaper this morning, he just fired the football coach at Michigan. So there's a person willing to stand up. Then we have outstanding data people, led by Henry Brady, who's dean of our Goldman School of Public Policy. We have some people from the private university world, including Shirley Tillman, the past president of Princeton, Larry Bacow, the past president of Tufts University, and now on the Harvard Corporation. So we have private universities well represented, so, foundations, et cetera. So this is a very broad group because academics alone are not going to solve this, the issues that public higher education faces. Okay. So how are we doing in California? Actually, we're doing pretty well to date. And so what we're talking about is not the present, but we're talking about the future. Okay. So there are all kinds of rankings of universities. So I have two prejudices in rankings and whether or not I use them. Prejudice number one is I don't believe any ranking whose primary purpose is to sell magazines or newspapers. Because inevitably their ranking system is going to be influenced by who buys their magazines or their newspapers. Okay, so that's number one. I'll tell you the second one in a minute. So the ranking I like best, which does not measure quality of undergraduate education. It measures the quality of graduate education and the quality of research, just to be clear up front, okay? And this comes from mainland China, from Shanghai, because the Chinese government is currently investing a huge amount of money in public higher education, and they want to know how they're doing. So they empowered Jiao Tong University in Shanghai to create a measurement system which would enable them to benchmark Chinese universities against the rest of the world. So to me, this is pretty good because they're asking the kind of questions we need to ask about how are we doing, okay? And it's all quantitative. So as a physicist, I like that, and there's nothing reputational. So they don't do surveys of, what university would you like your kids to go to? Rather, it's quantitative in terms of how do the graduates do? Do they win Nobel Prizes? How are your faculty doing? Do they do research that's impactful? Et cetera, et cetera. So they have a set of criteria. People can agree or they can disagree. But as I said, I happen to, with my biases of being at a place like Berkeley, agree with the set of criteria. They're not perfect, but they're much better than any of the rankings that are produced by magazines to sell magazines. Okay. So if you look at it, second from the right is the total score. And so this is the top 15 universities, and they rank 500. You want to see it for yourself, just Google ARWU, Academic Ranking of World Universities. You can get the top 500 by this ranking system, so it's quite interesting. And you see that Harvard, whether we like it or not, comes number one in the world, and by a huge gap. It's not close. No other university in the country is close to Harvard for its comprehensive excellence. And it's an empirical fact. It's not true field by field, and certainly not true in engineering, for example, but overall it's true. Then they're not physicists, so they don't give error bars. Okay. If they're physicists, we would have uncertainties. And then if you put in the uncertainties, just fluctuations year by year, because institutions don't change year by year, and you just look at how the numbers change, then it turns out there are 4 universities that are tied for second in the world, including error bars. And those 4 universities are Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, and Cambridge in England. Okay? Then there's a gap, right? Then we have Princeton, Caltech, Columbia, Chicago, Oxford, Yale. Then we get another UC, UCLA at number 12 in the world, and then UC San Diego at 14 in the world. Okay? So if you look, and you did the counting, 5 out of the top 15 universities in the world, according to the Chinese government, and you can't be more objective, are in California. Now, of course, much of this is historical. It represents a long-time investment. But the fact is that we have great universities in California, extraordinary in California. I gave a version of this talk a month ago in Toronto it was mostly actually community college people in the audience, and I showed some of these data. And Canada has the same population as California, first order. And there's no Canadian university in the top 20, so including the one I was president of, unfortunately. But anyway, so so we should be very, very proud of this. And I'll show you a couple of fields. Not sure how many I kept here, but if we look in science, then here Harvard drops from #1, and Berkeley moves up to #1. So in science, Berkeley is the top university in the world. And this is, and actually, this is really embarrassing to say, but we improved since the budget cuts. State made us stronger by taking away our money because we had to become more self-sufficient. That doesn't mean that there are not all kinds of other negative consequences of the state disinvestment. But UC system didn't collapse. We have to be honest about that, right? So when we make our arguments to the government, we have to be honest about the fact that disinvestment, extraordinary disinvestment in California by the state, didn't destroy the UC system. We are very strong universities, and we're resilient. And then you can see, let's see, this is a little more international, but the US overall does well. I think and we have UCLA at #9. So we have 2 UCs in the top 15. In engineering, it's interesting, the top 2 schools are MIT and Stanford, and then Berkeley is 3rd, but you will note, and I won't ask you to dwell on this, that engineering is a much more international field, and public universities dominate. So except for the top 2, almost all the other universities are public. So engineering is one field where the elite privates do not dominate, the public universities do, and there's a number of reasons for that. So it shows that, and it's very broad. In the US, you look, Berkeley's #3, but Urbana-Champaign is 4, Texas is 5th in the world, and if you come down, we finished with Texas A&M. So engineering is a field where public education does extraordinarily well. I'm going to just skip through the rest. I guess I should, since you're a medical doctor, I should stop in medicine. And a thing that's interesting and not appreciated probably outside of the Bay Area and up here to Sacramento is that UCSF is in terms of medical education and research, is the 2nd best university in the world, 2nd best medical school in the world. Extraordinary at a public institution. So one of my huge regrets as former chancellor of Berkeley was that UCSF used to be part of Berkeley, and we let it go. I mean, what a mistake that was, right? So just imagine, then we would probably be tied with, maybe even be ahead of Harvard if we had kept UCSF. But it's an incredible tribute to UCSF also, where the state funding, I think, is down to 4% of their budget, right? So they've achieved this preeminence in spite of the influence of the state. Okay. So now let me start going into some of the information that we've been gathering in the Lincoln Project. So the first time I saw this graph, I found it quite surprising, and the reason is I've lived my adult life in 3 states: New Jersey, but mostly Massachusetts, and then California. So my sort of thinking about universities, and private universities specifically, is formed by those 3 states. Princeton, when I was in New Jersey, I was at Bell Labs, but I lived near Princeton. Bell Labs may have been the best university I was ever at, but that's a whole separate. It's certainly the place where I had the most academic freedom. What was at Bell Laboratories? There's no ambiguity about that. So I had the good fortune of being in a great research institution where you could do whatever you want, and you had indefinite amounts of money, et cetera. But then in addition, we had Princeton. But if you look across the U.S. and you say, how many states have 2 or more high-end, in the research sense, private universities? It's an extraordinarily small number, and this had not occurred to me. So we have California, where we have 3 or more, right? Massachusetts, which has 3 or more. Pennsylvania, which has only 2, Carnegie Mellon and UPenn. Illinois, which has Northwestern and University of Chicago. And that's it. So there are only 5 out of the 50 states, 10%, which have 2 or more research universities that are comparable to Berkeley or Davis or what have you, right? Okay. And then a number that have only 1, and most of those that have only 1, like Texas, that's Rice, which is a great place. but they have like 4,000 undergraduates. So it has a really minimal impact on education in the state. So if we now look at and mostly it's empty. And so, whereas if you ask, if you go to Germany and you ask people in Germany about U.S. education, they'll then list 4 or 5 private universities before they get to the publics. But in fact, in terms of societal impact, private universities play only a minor role, hence the importance of public higher education. So I now show you the same graph with the same standards for the universities for publics. And you see it's completely different, and the country's almost filled with very high research activity. So these are AAU-type institutions, right? And so you see, and so there's only a small number of states that don't have universities with very high level of research activity at them. Okay? And they're small states like, or small population states like Idaho and South Dakota, et cetera. Okay. If we now come one level down to what's called high research activity universities, so Northeastern in Boston might be an example of that for a private university. Very good university, but not Harvard or MIT. Okay. Then you see that for the privates, the country is still mostly empty. And so it had not occurred to me that the state of Michigan does not have a private research university. It's a significant private research university. Neither does Minnesota, neither does Washington, neither does Arizona or New Mexico, et cetera, right? So again, I found this very surprising. If we now go to Publix, then you see it's filled. Every single state in the union, all 50, have at least one public university which has significant research activity and a faculty of the caliber that goes along with that. So if you had ever had any doubts about the importance of the health of the public higher education system in the United States, I hope this has then dispelled it. So the public universities dominate in terms of higher education from the point of view of research-intensive universities. Okay. So these are the conclusions from this sort of preliminary look, which, if nothing else on the Lincoln Committee, has motivated us to say we have to find solutions. Okay. If we now look at numbers, the numbers are quite interesting. So if we look at, these are very high research universities. If you look at research funding, then the publics and privates are not very different. So, but that was already somewhat evident in the data I showed from the Chinese about the ranking of universities. Federal research dollars are not very different. There are more postdocs at the privates. You see for undergraduates, the privates get many more national merit scholars. That's connected with the elitism and snobbery in the university system in the United States. So if someone gets into Harvard and they're a national merit scholar, and they also got into Berkeley, frankly, from the quantitative data, we know that they go to Harvard. And that's the reality. Also, with the members of the national academies, it's disproportionately biased towards the privates. Used to be almost all privates, but these are self-perpetuating organizations in which the members vote for new members. And so, okay, there will be some time before we overcome that. But overall, you can see that just in terms of research intensity, that the publics are doing very well. But what about their students? So if we look at the income distribution for students, and if you look at publics for low income and low middle income, right, then you see that almost close to 1/2 of students in public universities nationally come from low income or low middle income, right? Compared with the privates, where more than half come from high income or high middle income, right? And this is a fundamental difference between the public university system in the United States and the private universities, which is public universities are strongly oriented towards providing a pathway into mainstream society of bright, ambitious people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in my opinion, but I'm sociologically biased here, this is one of the most important aspects of public higher education, and it's one that is under threat. not within California, I don't believe, right now, but it will be if there's continued state disinvestment. But there's already been a continuous evolution in other states when we look at the data, away from serving the population as a whole and evolving towards serving the more privileged part of the population. And so when people often talk about privatization, you know, I had to listen to this all the time while I was Chancellor of Berkeley, that as the state took away money, then the administration got accused of privatizing the university. I would say, yeah, but suppose the state took all the money away from us. Does that mean we're private? Of course it doesn't, right? So as our Dean of Social Sciences said, the character of a university is determined not by where the money comes from, but how the university spends it. That's what defines the public nature of an institution. And that's what we have to preserve, but which I also believe nationally is under threat. Okay. So the other thing is you see that underrepresented minorities are overwhelmingly in public universities rather than private. So from the point of view of addressing ethnic imbalances in our society, which continue to be, as Ferguson has demonstrated, one of the most severe challenges that we face, public universities are the primary mechanism for addressing social inequality in society. And you see there is somewhat of a switch at the graduate level where many underrepresented minorities end up in private universities. Any questions? Okay. So how many students do publics and privates educate? So these are research universities. I want to keep emphasizing that. We're not talking, actually a couple of the Cal States are included in the HRAs, by the way. So this is overwhelmingly the UC, a couple of Cal States, and translate that into other states, okay? Right. Then you see that these institutions, Publix, educate close to 3 million undergraduate students. It's an extraordinarily large number, and in most states like Michigan and Washington, et cetera, and in California for that matter, except for the small number who go off to privates, these are the top students in the state. I mean, look at the number of applicants to every UC campus now, right? I mean, just extraordinarily well-qualified people, and there's who would like to come to our universities. And you also see at the graduate level that there are more than 2 times as many graduate students in public universities compared with privates. And in fact, if you look at national statistics, the university that produces the most PhDs every year is my own, Berkeley, and second is University of Texas. So the top 2 universities in terms of educating PhDs are public universities. So we play a critical role, and I was talking at lunch. We sometimes undersell the role that we play and the breadth of the impact. So a couple of years ago, I was telling students earlier, I gave the graduation speech at Santa Monica College. And so I arrived just sort of beginning of the afternoon. Complete aside, by the way. You need researchers like this. It turns out St. Monica is the patron saint of parents who are disappointed in their children, which led into a great start for my graduation speech. So I had a really good researcher at the time. So anyway, that's irrelevant. That's not relevant to anything. But, okay. So when I arrived at the college, then the president, whom I had met earlier, then took me in a room to introduce me to the faculty teaching at Santa Monica College, who were Berkeley PhD graduates. The room was filled, and if I'd been from UCLA, it would have been even bigger, a larger crowd. So we play a really critical role in supporting the community college system through just educating their teachers, right? And we sometimes underestimate that. Then I went into another room after that, and I met with the graduates who were transfer students who were going to be coming to Berkeley. And again, the room was filled. Right? It was inspiring. And these kids were so excited that they were going to be next autumn students at Berkeley. And this is almost unique in the country, this transfer system. And it's extraordinary, and it's a societal leveling mechanism. And the diversity in the transfer student body is literally double that, both economically and ethnically, in transfer students compared with those directly out of high school. because it's people being given a second chance. So this is a really extraordinary role that we play. Okay, this just summarizes this. Okay, let's now look at some of the evolution in funding. So first of all, what about student populations? So I already showed you that the AAU Publix, both the AAU, that's the very high research activity, and then the high research activities, okay, and then the non-AAU, you see that our student populations have been going up dramatically over the last 25 years, right? And of course, the publics totally dominate. And these are the privates down here, which have also been going up, but at a much slower rate. Okay. Right. These are data that I found to be really extraordinary. So now this includes research. Okay. And if you don't want it to include research, for almost every university, multiply the number by 0.7. Because in almost all of the research-intensive universities, the research budget is about 30% of the total. But personally, I don't think it's valid to remove the research money. You know, I've always had undergraduate students in my lab, right? What they do in my lab is paid for by research funds, but it's an important part of their education. So we can argue this either way, but it doesn't change anything. It only changes whether or not you multiply this axis by 0.7. So what you see, however, is, and this is really extraordinary, AAU private, so that's Harvard and MIT and Stanford, et cetera, they spend $140,000 a year per student. I mean, it's truly extraordinary, right? Whereas we bargains, okay, the AAUs, and specifically UC is right here on this line, the UC system, we spend about $50,000 per year per student. Okay. Again, if you don't think we should include research, which I don't agree with, but it doesn't matter, then we spend $35,000 a year per student, compared with a tuition of $12,000. This is a number that's often forgotten. So with the current high level of tuition, students who pay full tuition, which is a small fraction of them, are paying about a third of the actual cost of their education. It's very important in terms of public policy to understand that. Okay. So, and I once had was at an AAU meeting, and I happened to be sitting down between sessions with the president of MIT, the then president, Susan Hockfield. We started talking about cost of education. And I told her that at Berkeley, where her daughter ended up going to Harvard, I guess, but came to look at Berkeley, possibility of being an undergraduate. And from my days at MIT, I remember that we aggressively recruited graduate students who were undergraduates in the UC system because they were so well educated. We loved to get a UC undergraduate in our labs. I had a number from Berkeley specifically. So when I told her that we educate our undergraduate students for $35,000 each, she wouldn't believe it. She said, I can't believe you produce the quality of education you do at Berkeley specifically for $35,000 because they're spending $100,000. And she was not prepared to argue that MIT was doing a better job than Berkeley was. So you hear us get criticized all the time for our inefficiency. Actually, compared to the elite privates, we're a factor of 3 more efficient in educating students than they are. And the product speaks for itself. Okay. So we should not apologize, those of us in the UC community, for being wasteful or for wasting taxpayers or whomever dollars, because we do a very good job in spite of what one might read in the media. And these data show that quantitatively. Okay, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. Okay, but, and here's the catch. So these are national data. And this shows the funding. These are the elite Publix since 1987. And you see this absolute plummeting. And these are national data, and they include states which haven't cut funding. And so there are other states, like Colorado, which is actually much worse off than California, where I talked to the president of Colorado. I was giving a physics talk there, but I put in an hour of politics, went to meet with him. see what's happening in Colorado, they're actually now doing budget models on the assumption that the state funding will go to zero. They feel they have to do that to protect themselves. Okay, so they're assuming that's one of the options. Of course, when you're head of an institution, you always have to have a whole bunch of budget scenarios, right? But one of the budget scenarios they have has the state funding going to zero. And he said they view that as if not highly probable, at least one of the scenarios that they have to be prepared for. So as a result of having a broadly representative community, our trip time in Virginia, we had a local meeting in Michigan, and we have one coming up we had one in California, actually. We have one coming up in Texas. We do not believe, our committee is operating on the assumption that this is irreversible. That's not a popular notion with faculty, but if we're going to guarantee that we can maintain the health of the UC system and the public universities across the country, we have to deal with realities. And there's no evidence that this is going to turn around in a substantial way. So if that's the case, then we need strategies for at least stabilizing it. So you see funding per student is still plummeting across the country on average. So if we're going to stabilize it, right, we have to have strategies for stabilizing it, but then we need more sophisticated, we need new models for the support of public higher education. Okay. And you see the numbers down to $8,000 a student. I mean, it's a disgrace. So at Berkeley, as I just said, and at UC Davis and universities represented here, the cost per student is about $35,000. The real cost is $35,000. You sometimes see lower numbers, but those numbers leave out all kinds of things where you wouldn't have a university if you didn't include them, right? You have to have state-of-the-art classrooms, you have to have state-of-the-art research labs, et cetera, right? So this was relevant several years ago when we thought that the state cuts were due to the budget crisis. But it's not relevant anymore because the state cuts have continued, or at least funding has not been reversed, even though the economy in the US has recovered completely. So there are other causes of the disinvestment. And I'm not actually going to talk about those here. Okay. So to give you an idea, it's actually more extreme than most people think. So when I was recruited to Berkeley to be the chancellor, then part of the sort of recruitment enticement was that Governor Schwarzenegger and the president of the system, Bob Dines, had what became first famously and then infamously known as the Compact, right? And so I was told by the governor and by the president of the system that funding for the UC system as a whole was going to go up first at 5% a year for 3 years and then at 4% after that. If that had held in the dollars of 2012, my last but 1 year as chancellor at Berkeley, then we would have had $590 million of state funding. Instead, we got 240 on campus. So the cuts are actually more severe if you normalize them to what was promised by Schwarzenegger than appears popularly in the media. That turns out to be the salary and benefits of 1/2 of our academic staff, not the staff as a whole. So the state effectively took away funding that was promised by the governor for almost half of our staff. And so we had to do many things to survive, one of which included increasing student tuition significantly. Okay, so we went in 1981-82 from the state support being 52% to the worst was this year, my second last year as chancellor, down to, it was actually 10.5% of the budget came from the state. Okay, and so we saw this inversion. So when I started as chancellor, at that time student fees were the smallest component of the 4 major contributions to the budget. And by the time I had finished, student fees and research were about the same. So there has been a trade-off between state support and student tuition. But the student tuition actually has not totally compensated for the reduction in state funding, only for part of it, because costs have been going up progressively. Okay. One of the things that's changed dramatically is income from the endowment and philanthropy, which came close to doubling for Berkeley. And that didn't happen by accident. That happened by extraordinarily hard work by a large number of people and by a huge investment in the fundraising infrastructure. So fortunately, and here probably the fact I'd been at MIT for a long time and in the administration there helped, we basically saw what was coming. And we realized that to survive, we were going to have to do fundraising as well as the elite privates did it. And fundraising is a contact sport. You don't just send someone a letter and say, please give me $10 million, right? In fact, on average, the professionals will tell you it takes 7 personal interactions per donor before you get a significant gift. You don't just have 1 dinner, you have 7 dinners, okay? So you can't do that unless you have significant sized development staff. So in the middle of the budget crisis, fortunately, people didn't see this, we doubled the size of the development budget. And that has paid off at a remarkable level. So we went from raising at Berkeley $150 million a year to raising more than $350 million a year. So enormous improvement. And those funds went into students and faculty, scholarships, faculty salaries, research support, et cetera, right? And so now, and similarly happened at UCLA and UCSF, and Davis now has a major fundraising campaign. So I'm very proud of the fact that actually in my last year as chancellor, and then Nick Dirks has carried it on, now Berkeley outraises Princeton and MIT separately, which wasn't imaginable. So the state may have failed us, but individuals in California have stepped up in a way that's really admirable. So most of this money comes from individuals in California who want to preserve the excellence of the UC system. And for Berkeley, it's great families like the Goldmans, the Haasses, et cetera. Bark Simpson, okay. So it's been wonderful to watch, okay. So now I promise I talk about the budget and say some stuff that's controversial, I'm sure. Okay. So now, a truism, if you're a university administrator, is students hate tuition increases. They hate them with a passion, okay. You can, I mean, well, okay. If you're a chancellor and you want to have 5,000 angry people in front of your building, what you do is you jump tuition, okay? But people rarely stop to think about, what are the consequences, okay? And who's actually paying, right? Who actually will pay the tuition increase? And so, as I said in the beginning, in the entire discussion in the media, I challenge you to find an op-ed or an article which explains properly who's actually going to pay and why, and what are the consequences if they don't pay, okay? And so I'm going to tell that to you. Now, I have obvious conclusions of my own, which even got agreed to by Bob Reich, who's the most liberal person I know, and Emmanuel Sayas. So these are the 2 most sort of left-wing faculty we have at Berkeley, and both endorse everything I'm about to say, okay? So this does not mean I crossed over to the Tea Party. Okay, so this is what socially responsible people like Bob Reich and myself think, okay? So what will happen, I'm going to do it Berkeley specific. This will not happen at every other campus, and it's because other campuses need to make the change we made for treating middle-class people decently. And they have not done that yet, except for Davis, which has followed. So Davis is the only one to create a plan which treats middle-class families appropriately, okay, which we put in place in Berkeley 2 years ago. Okay. So who pays more? First of all, I had a lot of trouble figuring out why the governor was so hostile to it, the tuition increase, other than the fact that students hate tuition increases and their parents hate tuition increases, and parents, no one understands financial aid and how it works, so everybody hates tuition increases, right? And it's, what politician is going to run on, let's increase the tuition of UC Berkeley, or of UC? No one's going to run on that, right? Okay. But, in fact, it turns out that the first person who has to pay for a tuition increase is the state through the Cal Grant program. And for Berkeley, that's about $6 million increase in our budget. We would be getting from the governor's 4% $12 million, and it increased the 12 to 18. So the tuition, Napolitano's tuition increase actually increases the state funding by another 50% through the Cal Grant line. That's not broadly appreciated. And the total number for UC, I asked the people in OP, and they, for some reason, haven't advertised this. The number for UC is $38 million. Every year, the budget, if Napolitano's 5% held, I, by the way, don't actually support the 5%. I'll come to that later, full 5%, but that's a separate issue. But let's assume it held. Then the Cal Grant budget would go up by about $40 million every year, and that's cumulative, so 40, 80, 120. That's a huge cost to the government that's not been discussed publicly. And if you're paranoid like I am, you might think after years of senior administration that there's a reason it's not being discussed publicly, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, the second thing is, let's take Berkeley. Okay, so some graduate students will have to pay, jump to the third line, but my graduate students don't pay anything. I pay them, right? And that's typical. So the vast majority of graduate students don't pay anything. We pay them to be our graduate students. We pay their tuition, and we pay them a stipend. Okay, so graduate students are, tuition increases don't only affect people in professional schools and a few people who didn't manage to get fellowships or such like, right? Okay. At Berkeley, and this is now true at Davis, but the number's different, we very deliberately designed our financial aid program for middle-class students so that middle-class students would never have to pay a tuition increase. That's the way the algorithm was deliberately set up. That was done by me and a guy by the name of Frank Urey. We knew what we were doing. We knew there would be tuition increases because there had to be if you look at the budget. And we knew they would be controversial. So we said, let's make sure we protect middle-class students, who in my opinion actually have been the most, middle-class families have been the most challenged in California. So at Berkeley, therefore, only students whose family income are more than $150,000 will have to pay the 5% tuition increase. No one else. That's about a third of the students. Okay. So you might have said, well, that's not enough money, and it's not. The Cal Grant program provides the other part. Okay. So now you might say, and this comes to the income inequality part of my talk, then you might say, okay, but if I'm making $200,000 a year, I don't like having to pay another $600 for my kid to go to Berkeley. But then you might say, how much is the family income going up of someone who makes $200,000 a year? And here the data are very robust, and I had them reconfirmed yesterday. The average student who's in this category, their family income is going up at the rate of $10,000 a year. That's the average. $10,000 a year over the whole student population, okay? So what the tuition increase is asking is, it's asking that out of that $10,000, that the family be willing to pay $600, $200 of which will go to support low-income students, especially undocumented students, and $400 will go to support the budget. So that's the ask, 600 out of 10,000. And it's really important to understand that, okay? So who actually will pay less? I'd say it's counterintuitive because tuition's going up. How can people pay less? That's because of the return to aid and the way the UC financial aid system works, okay? So first of all of our undocumented students will pay less. They are the most vulnerable of all of our students because they don't get federal Pell Grants because they're not citizens, right? But they get everything else. And the Pell Grant is essentially replaced by return to aid. The tuition doesn't go up, return to aid does not go up, and therefore they don't get cost of living increases. So the most vulnerable students for having frozen tuition are undocumented students, and their debt will go up every year if tuition doesn't go up. You can say, who cares about them? You're free to have that as a political view. I don't have that view. I think our undocumented students are precious, and I think we're obligated morally to support them appropriately. If you look at the income distributions of African American and Chicano students, they overwhelmingly benefit from a tuition increase because they're heavily skewed to the low-income end. And there are very few underrepresented minority students, percentage-wise, who will have to pay any increased tuition. Okay. And finally, all low-income students generally. Okay. Then there's some stuff from UC. I'm just going to skip through this. But UC shows even for campuses that don't have our financial aid plan that in the long run, the middle class will see their net costs go down. I frankly, because we set it up, strongly prefer the financial aid plan we have for middle class students at Berkeley because it protects middle class students from tuition increases. And I believe every other campus can afford it, and I think they should just do it. And it's not hard. We did it. And you say, where does the money come from? The money, actually, I hate to admit this publicly, but it is known. If you look at our budget, you can figure it out. The money comes from financial aid we don't pay to international students. So the money we don't pay to international students is redirected to California middle-class students. And with the dramatic increase in number of international students at all of the campuses, every campus has enough money that they otherwise would have had to have given out in financial aid, right, which international students don't get, and therefore is available for middle-class Californians. So it's totally doable financially. Okay. So let me just skip through this. So let me now come to the end. Of course, I just stuck in the part about that you just heard after the Regents meeting, right? This wasn't part of the last time actually, I did this talk to a bunch of students at Berkeley who sort of knuckled under, to my surprise. But otherwise, this was not part of it until recently. So let me come back to the Lincoln Project, and let's talk about the national scene for higher education. So who's missing? So we believe, not just me, but essentially everyone on the committee, and I stated it, that the disinvestment by state governments is irreversible. And all the politicians tell us that. And they give us a lot of reasons, which I can't reproduce all of them, why they believe that that's true. And so we accept their judgments. Okay? These are serious people who support higher education, that it's not reversible. So we need, and we can't just keep indefinitely increasing tuition. I'm not advocating for that. And some of the issues I addressed about undocumented students, et cetera, are addressable other ways. But if you look at the US, then unlike all the countries we compete with economically, the federal government's simply missing. They provide research funding, but they do not provide any money whatsoever for the support operations of our great research universities, great public universities. We're alone in that. We have some specific ideas of how the federal government might contribute without exercising control, which we don't want, which Frank Yeary and I have socialized with both Democrats in Washington and Republicans in Washington, and they're well received. So people in Washington understand the challenges that public universities are facing. The people in the bureaucracy do. And they know that ultimately they're going to have to do something, and the issue is to find a model, right, in which they will step up. Every single politician says, we agree completely, but there's no new money. So we'd love to do it, but we can't. My response is, do you believe that every federal dollar is well spent? And you're telling me you can't find a place where money's being wasted that would be better invested in higher education? And especially the Republicans always agree, every single time, right? So I believe that with enough work, with bipartisan support, we will be able to get federal government support. Secondly, and this frankly makes me angry, is the first order, especially in California, industry is free rider. It's a free rider. These major corporations that are so famous and that are supporting the California economy, they invest nothing in higher education. They hire our graduates, and they complain that we don't educate enough engineers, right? So every time I hear that, I say, fine, why don't you invest in us, right? So they're simply missing. And so then one more responsible than usual head of one of the most famous firms in California had said this, and he said, yes, I understand completely. Berkeley graduate, he said, our stockholders would never stand for it. What does that mean? So I have a solution. So physicists like to look at complicated problems and find simple things to suggest. We, found a simple way of supporting middle-class students. so they don't have to pay tuition increases. So this is my other middle class, my other solution. Okay, and this will work. Okay. If you ask how much money California corporations are holding offshore, it's shocking. It's shocking. Okay. So I asked the president of one of the corporations, a person who's been himself personally a major donor to Berkeley, very friendly to us, how much money does your company have offshore? It was $15 billion. What are you doing with it? Well, we have a hedge fund, and we're investing. They now make more money on their hedge fund of their offshore money than they do from the product they produce. Okay. Right? I mean, that's what they should do. They shouldn't just let the money sit there in the bank account, right? So they make 12% a year. If California corporations that are holding this $1 trillion offshore simply repatriated 1% a year and gave it to higher education, that solves the funding problem permanently. It's a very simple solution, right? They're making 12% a year. We're only asking for 1/12 of it, 1%. They can do it tax-free, and it would help their image a lot. And then it's solved, right? Then for students who hate tuition increases, then I'll soften my stance, and I'll say, let's find another way of doing the financial aid for undocumented students and for underrepresented minorities, et cetera, right? So we'll find some other solution to inflationary increases, which currently cost them, okay? So I have not yet found a single person, business person in California who agrees with my simple but elegant solution. But I actually believe that it will be possible via the federal government, maybe by favorable tax treatment of some other part of their offshore money. So they're not going to do it for free, but maybe if they repatriate 1% for higher education and are allowed another 1% without taxes, they'll figure out that's a net profit for them, which it would be. Okay. That would require the federal government to cooperate. So that's a way in which the federal government, at no apparent cost to itself, right, could solve the problem for public higher education. Not just California. We would have to socialize this, and so, you know, Nevada and New Mexico, et cetera, would have to get some of our high-tech money probably. But we have manufacturing plants there because lots of these companies don't like to manufacture in California because of our environmental laws. So, right. So anyway, so we can distribute these funds around. So sorry I went on a little longer than I intended, but thank you for being a very attentive audience. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Hi. It's possible. Is it probable? No. It's possible, but even within the UC system, I mean, we at Berkeley, I would say, represented one limit in terms of our unrelenting commitment to it. There were others who wanted, you know, different people had different views, and so in the end, maybe I should be more pessimistic and say, in the end, inevitably, the universities would privatize, right? Because the culture would probably evolve, because it requires a lot of strength at the leadership level to take money that could go to faculty salaries and put it into financial aid, which is what we do, right? There's so much pressure, right, to retain the best faculty, to pay them, you know, the same salaries as the Publix get, right? And the monies are completely interchangeable, right? So inevitably, probably I would have to concede that in the long run, if the state removes its money, the public universities, the elite ones, will progressively privatize. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we've done some amount of that. My first major start at that failed, which was a Richmond Bay campus. It failed because the Department of Energy withdrew their money. They were going to be an anchor tenant, and so we were thinking of moving in that direction. Now, my successor, Nicholas Dirks, has another strategy that doesn't rely on the Department of Energy. So we've put some amount of into that, but we can do better. But I find it so. It's simple, and it's one thing after we had a celebration in Berkeley, so I have to tell people a fact, which I'll give you in a minute. So we had a celebration at Berkeley in which we celebrated a few weeks ago the 50th anniversary of my first scientific publication. Right. I had to tell people I was 21 years old when I did it, and it was one of my most important physics papers for a long time, which was really embarrassing, that with no education whatsoever in physics, because I wasn't a physics major, I did something that was more important than I managed to do for 2 decades, but anyway, that's really, really bad. But anyway, so what I learned in my 50 years of research in physics is that almost always the simplest solutions are the ones that work best. And as soon as it gets complicated, then politicians will put riders on the bill, and they'll do this and they'll do that, right? So I like this, or some, I happen to like this because I thought it up, but I'm sure there are other solutions that are simple and can't be restructured in a way that they lose their purpose. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. So, in good part, what you're talking about is our communications challenge of how do we enable everyone to understand what the financial model is, right, of the university. But as a parent of 4 kids, where my kids didn't qualify for financial aid, they were in school when I was a regular professor, not making this obscene salary that chancellors make. That's a joke. But anyway, so things have changed at that time. I took out a huge home equity loan on our house, which lasted 15 years for me to pay it off. I was glad to do that. I felt as a parent I owed my kids, right, an education, and I was willing to mortgage our house up to the hilt to pay for their education. And they have terrific lives as a result of the education that they received. I think we need to return to an ethos where parents say, this is my obligation as a parent to provide an education, and I'm willing to mortgage my house and not take a vacation, et cetera. Right? Yes? Right. Yeah, sure, of course. Well, obviously, private sector funds research because they want research done that's going to help them make a profit. But we shouldn't be delusional about that. The percentage is extraordinarily small, right? So contract research from companies is, 5% of the total research budget or something like that. During my time, we had a lot of controversy connected with the funding that came from BP for alternative energy research. And it turned out that when that funding came, we got parallel funding from the federal government. It has turned out that BP is a wonderful sponsor and lets you do almost whatever you want. The federal government's very restrictive. Okay. So the research that restricts academic freedom is the research funded by the federal government. Research that respects academic freedom is funded by this corporation. You won't read that, but it's empirically true. Okay. So, so of course you have to have in place protections that make sure you protect students, et cetera, right, when you have contract funding from corporation. But we don't do that well in California at all. Partly it's the political environment. So, and almost all the funding we have of universities in California for research comes from companies that are based either in mostly in Europe, but also in Asia. There's very little American investment in universities by corporations. And so it's Siemens and BP and, some companies based in Shanghai. So American, I can give you a whole speech about the irresponsibility of American corporations, but I won't do that because that's personal politics, right? But European and Asian companies are more socially responsible towards universities, which is counterintuitive, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sure it does, right? But I was in that category because my wife didn't work at the time my kids were in college, and that's why I told the story about mortgaging my house to the hilt, because I saw it as a parental responsibility. So you're right. I mean, there are. That's the trouble when you do this kind of analysis, right? That the economists do, which is you average over all kinds of people, and there are people for whom it will be nothing. I mean, trivial. $600 out of $10,000 is nothing, right? But there are other people for whom it will be a challenge. Oh, I agree to that. And maybe there's a way of building in protections. Maybe in time the 150,000 will be able to be moved up. Actually, I think it could be moved up if Senator De Leon is not successful in John Perez's middle class financial aid program survives. The politics here in Sacramento, because if you add the Perez money onto the return to aid of the international students that they don't get, that would be enough to move the 150 up significantly. So I think all of those things, everything's on the table, right? Nothing's written in stone, and I think if you find out that a plan is imperfect, then you change it, basically, right? But it is a fact. I mean, and it's the essence of income inequality. It's what drives the professionals in this, like Bob Reich and Emmanuel says, crazy, is that the low-income people are just, it's worse and worse and worse for them in our society, in American society. And the people in the, $200,000 plus, and I agree there are exceptions to that, they're just getting better and better off every year. And so this disparity is growing. And this oddly, this kind of a tuition mechanism, protection mechanism that I talked about is one that actually helps address that. Yes? Sure, yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. First of all, it can apply to all UCs, right? We all have graduates. Obviously, I played an important role in it because the chancellor does by definition. I put a lot of personal energy into talking to our alums who were deathly afraid that they would just be putting their private money in to replace state money, and explaining to them that's not the situation. Basically convincing them that the state disinvestment was irreversible, so it's not substitution, it's going to save us, right, et cetera. And as I said, you need a lot of people because you have to have people doing research, you have to have people who set up the meetings, et cetera, right? So it's a 7-to-1 ratio payoff. So you invest 10 million and you get 70 million, right? That's a lot, okay? I believe, all of the UCs except Merced have been around long enough that every single UC has graduates who are in their, let's say, 60s. And I know from personal experience, psychologically, you get your kids through college, you pay off the second mortgage, right? In my case, I moved up in the ladder, so suddenly my salary doubled, literally, right? So suddenly you're making more money, then you become philanthropic, right? And it happens, right? So that's now true for every UC campus, except Merced. So I believe every UC campus can start raising. They may not raise our $350 million a year, but they can move up significantly. Interestingly, in Virginia, when we met with the university presidents, every single major university in Virginia now sees this as the solution. Virginia Tech, Virginia Commonwealth. It's a little strange, not where we should be, but it is where we are. That was sort of brilliant. So now let's talk about community colleges. So I have one of our donors to Berkeley, who's a personal friend, gave $25 million as a challenge grant to community colleges for scholarships for low-income students. They had to match it. In the end, they couldn't raise $25 million. That's Bay Area community colleges. They couldn't raise it, right? And so he actually had to take the money back. You know, we raised $25 million at Berkeley in a month, right? And so I actually met with them because we'd had so much success at Berkeley. And they just said, it's a horrible, I mean, you know, we complain in UC, but it's a horrible situation budget-wise in the community colleges. It's a disgrace because they don't have $100 million donors, right? And they said, we just don't have a penny. And they said, we heard what you just said, but you know, you can't just hire one person, you got to hire 5. And they said, we can hardly pay our faculty. So it's not realistic for community colleges at all. I think it's probably realistic for the Cal States, but I don't know the details of their budget enough to know. So I know it doesn't work for community colleges, it's hopeless, right? It can work for every UC and probably some of the Cal States. But that's a very good question. When I came to Berkeley, I was told people wouldn't give at the level they gave when I first started out, right? And I was very fortunate because while I was the Dean of Science at MIT, I raised a huge amount of money for MIT in Silicon Valley. A huge amount, okay? So I'd spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley raising money, but when people at Berkeley told me Californians are not generous and they won't give, people in Silicon Valley won't give, I said, I know as an empirical fact that's not true, right? And it wasn't true. We just had to make the case. Okay, yes?